Hello and welcome. This evening we're going to look at learning under lockdown. And we're going to discuss some tools and tips for online learning about Africa and the world. Studying Africa in our current circumstance is not easy. The COVID-19 lockdown has radically altered research, teaching, and learning in African studies at all levels, from K through 12 classrooms through to advanced postdoctoral archival research. For the foreseeable future, it will no longer be possible to watch a movie together in a classroom, nor can groups take field trips to museums to view important African collections, nor will it be possible to assemble in auditoriums to hear from a visiting guest speaker from Africa itself, or anywhere else for that matter, reporting on current circumstances in Africa. Further, while African studies has had to go totally virtual almost overnight, there are so far very few online textbooks that are accessible to assist teachers to design virtual classroom materials and teach under COVID-19 circumstances. To compound these problems, it would seem that for the foreseeable future, the prospect of initiating long-distance travel to Africa for research, educational exchange programs, or even for tourism will remain unrealistic for some time to come. All of these features of our current circumstance combine to mean that the studying about Africa from Americans or from Europeans or from anyone at this point is now quite difficult. Fortunately, there are a growing number of online assets that can help in this circumstance. Both faculty and students at all levels can begin now to use these online resources to build new online curricula for learning and teaching about Africa. These are a few of the resources listed here with links, which individuals, schools, or libraries with internet access can begin to mobilize in the service of research and teaching about Africa. Some immediate graphic sources on Africa and the world are available. First thing to get across and understand thoroughly, and it's not always understood even by our highest political leaders, Africa is not a country. You might ask, well, how big is Africa? Well, in fact, it's quite large, and that can be seen online very dramatically. We're going to take a look at how to do that in a moment. Furthermore, we're going to see how to use Google search engine and find maps with Google Maps and Google Earth. Then we're going to look at some resources on African history, a series of programs which have been made by various scholars over the years and observers, people like Ali Masrui, who put out a series in 1983, Basil Davidson, who put out a series in 1984, Africa's Great Civilization, hosted by Henry Louis Gates Jr., in 2017 is one of the more impressive recent contributions in this kind of field. There is also a more in-depth study of regional specialties within Africa, like this Gold Road collection put together by Howard University and Boston University, with a close study of maps and particular subjects within the area of West Africa and its gold origins in the international trade. Finally, beyond that medieval West African history, there's a history recently produced in a 20-part series by Zainab Badawi in coordination with the BBC News System. And this has been posted online episode after episode so that each of them being about 45 minutes each, with 20 episodes. You have about 15 hours of material on the history of Africa to draw upon. Beyond that, there are some resources available in historical map collections, and you can find out more about these through the Africa Map Circle. We'll come back to this and look at it in detail in a moment. But let's explore these assets one at a time so you can see what we mean by online resources. First of all, Africa is not a country. We need to learn this and we need to teach this. We need to see how big Africa really is. You can see this by clicking on it and taking a look at the links that were provided here. If you take a look at the size of Africa to begin with, it's apparent from just laying the outlines of other countries within its borders that it's an enormous, enormous continent. It can contain within itself, in area terms alone, the United States, all of India, all of China. It's really quite staggering when you look at the size of the whole continent of Africa. This is why it's absolutely crucial to keep in mind, with such a great area and so many different cultures, that it's a very, very difficult place to understand from the outside. The United States, Spain, France, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, India, China, and Japan can all fit within its boundaries in terms of area, and the UK is not much bigger than Madagascar, the offshore island. You can look at particular comparisons over here in the right-hand column. The United States, all of Europe can fit rather easily into West Central Africa, India into East Africa and the Horn. Japan is but a sliver over here, and even all of China does not take up as much of a surface area as the continent of Africa. In fact, there are 18 countries, major countries, that can be fit into the area size of Africa. So this is one thing to understand and study in detail. So that, as a beginning, is a good way to start with online resources. And you can do this in greater detail by getting students to use Google Maps and Google Earth. You can click again and link to these things off of the links provided in the PDF file. Google Earth looks, and Google Maps looks very familiar to anybody with access to it on their cell phones. And you can see how you can use this certainly in analyzing current affairs very quickly. When you're given information about where something is emerging, say in Port Harcourt, or in Ibadan, or in Lagos, or in the capital city of Ghana, which is Accra, you can very easily zoom in on these areas on the map and find out where they are in reference to one another and what their general characteristics are. If you click on major cities, you often get a descriptive material that's provided as well, and you can click on the pictures there and often get a sense of what's involved in the city area through a series of slides that are made possible. through connecting in this rather simple fashion. At the same time, you can go back and explore in different parts of Africa very quickly. I urge students to get used to doing this kind of exploration and identifying particular areas that are talked about in the news or that you want to illustrate information about to them. In addition to the maps, you can look towards Google Earth. Google Earth is an alternate way of looking at this, not through maps, but through what are called space photographs. They're basically pieced together from satellite imagery. And if you click on that link provided, you can then call up the link to Google Earth. This is the web version of Google Earth, and it takes a while to call up because it's calling up enormous amounts of data behind it. But once it does load, you can see what you're seeing, in a sense, from the vantage point of space. In this particular case, we've asked it to outline the borders of countries, so you can see that, and as you zoom in, you can see them one at a time become more clear, and the labels of those countries become printed as well. You can move around the map by clicking the left button and dragging the map slowly. If you do this too quickly, the system will probably not respond and may go black or blank for a while because it has to shift so much data to bring in these perspectives. You can use also these zoom in and zoom out facilities that allow you to look in greater detail, as well as double clicking on the particular area that you want more information about, and that will zoom in gradually to that area. You can customize the kinds of things that are displayed on the map in options over here, and you can look for particular areas. For example, if we look for Dakar, Senegal, we could rapidly be taken on a very quick space tour and parachute process right into the city of Dakar. Once again, maps are provided sometimes with additional textual material and photographs. And in this case, we've asked it to illustrate roads, major roads. So you can see these are filled in as well. You can take those out by the specifications over here in the left-hand column by basically telling it to have a different map style. For example, if we clean it of everything, that will take away the roads. And you will see this is on a peninsula. Dakar is on the peninsula, Cape Verde Peninsula, out into the Atlantic. As you zoom backwards, you can see how it juts out into the Atlantic quite a ways. Well, this is an asset you can start to use with students very easily and encourage them to explore the whole continent of Africa with the use of these online tools. Secondly, there are resources on African history that we've mentioned briefly. Ali Mazrui, back in the early 1980s, recorded a whole series that he put up in a series called The Africans, A Triple Heritage. The link to it is here. You can see a version of it that's been put up on YouTube through the link. It was initially aired on public television in 1983. Actually, it was conducted before that with a series of interviews, 9 programs, 57 minutes each, in which he narrates this material. He's written it and he narrates it from within Africa itself. as he calls it, a commentary. It's a personal perspective written and presented by Ali Mazrui. And, as I say, presented on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting early on. It was a co-production of WETA TV and the BBC TV back in the 1980s, early 1983. Now, they did thank a whole series of rather prominent African historians, Professor Ade Ajayi, Professor Ali Darwish, um, Professor Davis Roberts, Professor John D. Fage from the University of Birmingham in England as one of the authors of many early books on African history, and Professor Joe Harris as well. So they drew upon, and Ali Mazrui knew them all personally and drew upon their expertise as well as what he knew as having been born in Africa and having taught about it in American universities for years. An equally ambitious and written from another point of view perspective on Africa was presented by a series under the direction, executive direction of Basil Davidson in 1984. This was an interesting departure in many respects. He too took the form of narrating much of it from within Africa. But his perspective is quite a bit different than that of many other African scholars at the time. You can get a link to it here and take a look at it by simply clicking here and following the links that are provided. It was called, as I say, Africa, written and presented by Basil Davidson. You get a sense of it by, again, clicking on the excerpts of it here provided in the links. Take a look.
Just over 100 years ago, a wandering prospector, a German by origin called Karl Mauch, searching for gold, came through these remote hills on a long trail and stumbled on this. He was the first white man ever to see it. And what he'd found, though he didn't know, were the largest man-made structures in any part of old Africa south of the valley of the Nile. What were these mysterious ruins found so unexpectedly in the far interior of Africa? About the ancient history of the black peoples, nothing was remembered in the outside world or even known. Today, at last, we're beginning to learn. We know now that these great buildings stood at the heart of a powerful black kingdom. Within these almost overwhelming walls, the kings lived in royal seclusion, adding to their mystery according to the nature of kings. Invested with a religious as well as a temporal power, they were believed to embody the whole welfare of their people. A stone-built city in the heart of Africa, and yet the white people who first saw it were so blinded by their prejudices that they could not believe the evidence of their own eyes. Rather than face the possibility that Africans might have a history of their own, they fabricated exotic explanations and imagined fantastic rites in honor of faraway monarchs like King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The famous German philosopher Friedrich Hegel had set the tone. Though he'd never been to Africa and knew nothing of its people, this was his publicly expressed opinion in 1831.
This is the land where men are children, a land lying beyond the daylight of self-conscious history and enveloped in the black color of night. At this point, let us forget Africa, not to mention it again. For Africa is no historical part of the world.
In a manner which seems quite unforgivable today, Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries preferred to forget what their forebears had known very well, that kingdoms flourished in West Africa which were as sumptuous and as well governed as any in medieval Europe itself. What is more, the reports of traders and diplomats who visited these kingdoms assumed no attitudes of racial superiority. Racism, in fact, is a rather modern sickness. Nothing more clearly illustrates the change that was to come than the European art of the Renaissance, and earlier still. White and black take their place in these paintings with equal dignity. There's no hint here of what a later world was to call human nature in its crudest state. And this acceptance of equality between black and white had also been a keynote of the Middle Ages. Among the revered saints of Central Europe was the black martyr, St. Maurice. As we shall see, he's one of the heroes of this story. What then was the cause of this enormous change in white attitudes from equality to racist prejudice? History gives one dominating reply: the Atlantic trade in slaves. Based in strong castles on the West African coast, the nations of Europe vied with each other in the massive removal of millions of captured men and women. Their guns were not pointed at Africa, which was seldom regarded as a source of danger, but out to sea, ready to face rival ships suddenly appearing over the horizon. Africans, of course, have not been the only victims of racism and color prejudice. But if, as I believe, they've suffered more acutely than the other peoples of the world, the reason lies here. For over 300 years, this magnificent coast was the scene of organized and systematic cruelty. Year after year, black people were dragged from their homes into the white man's world of misery and degradation. They were presented as less than human, objects for buying and selling, like cattle, against whom any act of violence and debasement was justified. Wherever the slave trade spread its ruin, the stability and fabric of African life were destroyed. But something else was also destroyed, and that was the mutual respect which had previously existed between white and black. But after all, the slave trade ended a long time ago. Surely it's time to think again. Those old ideas about black inferiority were completely wrong, without foundation. As it happens, modern science has given us a vast fund of new and reliable knowledge which shows that the black peoples do indeed have a history of their own, as rich and strange, as long and sometimes surprising as any major branch of the human family.
Students can be encouraged to see the Basil Davidson series. There's a whole series of them, each about an hour long, and they can be studied one at a time or in sequence. More recently, many more people will be aware of the presentation of Africa's great civilization made by and hosted by Henry Louis Gates Jr. on the PBS television networks. Henry Louis Gates Jr. has presented an enormous array of historical material to the American public through the PBS system, and this is quite an extraordinary achievement, bringing together the latest scientific information and talking about what, in fact, we now know since these earlier series were completed. Basil Davidson's work was in 1984. Professor Gates completed his work in this series in 2017, and it's worth having a look.
From the origins of human civilization to the threshold of the modern world, I'll be going on a journey through 200,000 years of Africa's rich history. Great cities, breathtaking architecture, art of unparalleled beauty and technical brilliance. This is the untold story of how for thousands of years, Africans helped shape our modern world.
Africa's Great Civilizations premieres Monday, February 27th at 9, 8 Central, only on PBS.
I'm Henry Louis Gates Jr., and I'm the executive producer and host of Africa's Great Civilizations. I've studied and taught African literature, but I've learned so much more making this series.
The fossil evidence and the archaeological evidence that's come to light in the last 20 or 30 years is very, very substantial.
Now, that's important to keep in mind. The evidence that's come to light in the last 20 or 30 years means that it was since the documentation that was put forward by Ali Mazrui and Basil Davidson. Their contributions were 1984 and 1983, and in fact, this is in the year 2017. Professor Gates draws upon the latest scientific information from Dr. Richard Leakey.
Maybe as much as 3/4 of what's in this film I didn't know 5 years ago.
Now that's an extraordinary admission in itself. Maybe as much as 3/4 of what's in the film, Professor Gates admits to not having known 5 years ago. Well, he couldn't have known it if it wasn't in fact published and made available to the public by the scientific community.
This is stunning. Stunningly beautiful.
It is.
We've been taught to think of Africa as static, isolated, frozen in time, no development. There were trade networks all over Africa, refuting this myth that these people were waiting on Stanley and Livingston to show up and discover them.
If you look at this map, it's right at the center of a nexus of trade routes that link it right across the continent. But it's not just the continent, it's beyond.
Africa was always in contact with the rest of the world. This is one of the big surprises.
Throughout most of the Middle Ages, Europe was on the gold standard, and without African gold, the whole currency of Europe basically would fall.
This was someone who had influence not just within Africa, but beyond. And it's a fantastically wealthy kingdom.
Mansa Musa was the world's richest human being ever, worth $400 billion.
This is what people don't know about Africa, is that there were these amazing cities that were effervescent. People were writing, creating things, doing innovations in law, in trade.
Africans were as complex and as interesting and brilliant as everybody else in the history of the world.
Well, that too becomes the perspective that is shared by Henry Louis Gates Jr., very simply put forward 30 years earlier in the early 1980s by historians like Basil Davidson and Ali Mazrui, but documented now with greater historical depth and the contributions of the latest science from people like Dr. Richard Leakey, and presented over the public broadcasting system. There are a series of 6 major presentations, hour-long presentations, actually around 53 minutes each in season 1. And again, the interviews are what strengthen it. Interviews like those from Leakey and Professor Suzanne Blier here at Harvard. Other area studies and concentrations have focused on particular regions, not the whole continent, but particular regions of Africa, like the medieval Gold Road. Take a look. If you call up the link that we provided there, you can, in fact, go to this resource by clicking on that material and getting into Howard University's interactive map on the history of the gold trade, what they call the Gold Road out of West Africa, and the succession of states that emerged in the medieval period is really quite interesting. If you click on the various icons for each of these states, you can see what area they covered at the time. The Mali Empire succeeded the Ghanaian or the Ghana Empire, and that was in turn succeeded by the Songhai Empire. In addition, students and teachers can teach one another about the people, the trade terms, the architecture, and the places that were dominant in each one of the periods of the different empires. It's a very helpful interactive map of this particular region of Africa, not trying to generalize about all regions of Africa or give a comprehensive overview, but studying in detail a particular region. So this too is an online asset that you should make use of and learn from in great detail. Finally, there's a more recent video sequence put together with Zainab Badawi from the BBC, which they've called The History of Africa. Once again, trying to cover kind of area-wide, that is the whole continent-wide. And in this case, this is not a historian nor an academic, but a news presenter. And BBC News puts it out on YouTube for everyone to get access to it. She provides several 45-minute segments, 20 of them, chapter by chapter, that can be called up one at a time and used very instructively. Take a look, because she draws upon, in this case, the current scholarship of African scholars. People like Professor Augustin Hall, Cameroonian, who's worked on this. Professor Firi from the University of Zambia. Professors Perby and Sutherland Addy from the University of Ghana, discussing, among other things, domestic slavery and the international slave trade. All of these people have contributed to and drawn from a new series put out by UNESCO called The General History of Africa. These are the volumes upon which the BBC bases this series, and it's worth getting these volumes for reference if your library can. These are the first 3 volumes of the series, and these are abridged volumes. It's called the abridged edition. So the scholarship that's come out in the last few years, few decades, certainly has updated what was put forward by Ali Masrui and Basil Davidson in the 1980s. Take a look, for example, at her treatment of the Rise of Aksum, one of the kingdoms in Northeast Africa.
A unique civilization arose in this part of East Africa, with what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea at its center, the Kingdom of Aksum. In its heyday in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, it was described as one of the world's 4 greatest civilizations. The rulers of the Kingdom of Aksum controlled trade between Africa, Arabia, and India. And according to local tradition, Aksum was founded by the son of the legendary Queen of Sheba and is home to the sacred Ark of the Covenant. Ethiopia is also the birthplace of coffee, an enduring gift to a grateful world. Northern Ethiopia, not far from the border with Eritrea. When we examine the history of this region before, during, and after the Kingdom of Aksum, it is the history of both Ethiopians and Eritreans today. The early morning mist in the highlands that make up some of the most dramatic landscape of both Ethiopia and Eritrea. This is southern Eritrea, which enjoys a long coastline on the Red Sea, a vital maritime route which helped establish this part of Africa as a hub of international trade throughout the millennia. This is one of the most beautiful, unspoilt stretches of the Red Sea coast. You can see from the clearness of the water that this is one of the last remaining unpolluted marine environments on the planet. I wonder what underwater secrets from the distant past it might harbor. To understand the rise of the ancient Kingdom of Aksum, we first have to delve further back into history to find out more about the people who laid the foundations for Aksum's greatness. We begin with the ancient land of Punt, which is in a region now known as the Horn of Africa. It was the ancient Egyptians who named it Puntland, which means the land of the gods. There's evidence the Egyptians traded with the people here some 3,500 years ago, arriving in their distinctive ships. There are records of voyages to Punt depicted in the temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Dar al-Bahri in Egypt. Punt was an important source of the gold that the Egyptians used to decorate their tombs. Jewelry, perfumes, and oils also formed much of this trade.
Well, once again, you can see that there's a great deal of emphasis upon the new kinds of external trade, in this case with Egypt, that were brought into focus for the history of the rise of Aksum and eventually the fall of Aksum. She also deals very interestingly with slavery on the west coast of Africa, much like Basil Davidson did back in the 1980s, but it's worth noting the difference. She has access to greater information, and she can place it in the context of what's now known about the area. Let's take a look.
One of the most tragic chapters in human history is the transatlantic slave trade, when at least 12 million enslaved Africans were violently and cruelly uprooted from their homes and sent across the Atlantic Ocean to strange lands. It's thought that as many as 2 million died before they even got there. In this episode, we look at how, where, and why this slave trade began, and the devastation it wreaked on Africans and their continent.
There was not a single spot of a continent that was out of reach of enslavers. It is more than the physical destruction of people. There was no hope for anyone for centuries.
So the consequences is the development of Africa, just because they chose the youngest and the strongest.
The transatlantic slave trade that existed between the 16th and 19th centuries was as catastrophic as it was extensive. This is Ghana's Atlantic coast, and I've come here to give you a sense of just how many European nations were involved in the slave trade. There are more than 30 old slave trading forts along a 250-kilometre stretch of beach today, built by various European powers.
Cape Coast Castle was built by the Swedes in 1653, but it changed hands 5 times over the next 11 years, ending with the British. Now, when the castle was originally built, it wasn't done very well. The roofs would leak, the ceilings were pretty dodgy, and the walls were quite insecure that they could even collapse. And so the whole castle was rebuilt in the mid-1770s.
Now, that's an interesting aspect of things we should look at again. Take how she formulates this about Cape Coast Castle, the same castle that Basil Davidson talked from back in 1984.
Cape Coast Castle was built by the Swedes in 1653, but...
Well, was Cape Coast Castle built by the Swedes? Well, not really. It may have been built under the power of the Swedes, but you can bet that it took a lot of local labor to build such a massive structure. What's interesting is that she then focuses on how quickly it changed hands among the Europeans, because the combat, as Basil Davidson pointed out, was largely focused on the sea and the potential that rival European powers might present by invading from the sea.
It changed hands 5 times over the next 11 years, ending with the British. Now, when the castle was originally built, it wasn't done very well. The roofs would leak, the ceilings were pretty dodgy, and the walls were quite insecure that they could even collapse. And so the whole castle was rebuilt in the mid-1770s.
Okay, the whole castle was rebuilt in the 1770s. Very interesting time frame. What else was happening in the British Empire in the 1770s? Well, Americans might remember the date of 1776, and for that matter, 1775, when the shots heard around the world started to reverberate. In any case, it's possible to relate local history in America to the kinds of history that are being now talked about from Africa. I'd urge you to get in touch by linking to this and seeing the whole series. Finally, there's a whole series of maps that you can start studying now because of historical map collections that have been digitized and made available online. Some of these have very interesting introductions through the Africa Map Circle. So you can take a look at collections like those at the Library of Congress, made available through their digitalization of African maps. With this address here, clicking on the logo will get you to there. The New York Public Library similarly has collections devoted to Africa Plus maps, and you can call them up and look at them online. Stanford University has libraries that have focused again on the assemblage of digitized images of maps of Africa. Very useful resource to draw upon for learning about Africa and teaching about it. University of Illinois has digital collections of maps of Africa to 1900, largely because of the intervention of a very important geographer, Tom Bassett, who has collected some maps on his own in West Africa and contributed them to the cataloging department at the University of Illinois Library, and they're integrated with the collections available in the library itself. Very helpful set of resources. In addition, Northwestern University, which has a very strong African studies tradition, has digital maps from the 16th to the early 20th century maps of Africa that are accessible online by clicking on these images. And finally, one of the most powerful and immediately useful online libraries in the world is located in Boston. It's called Afroterra, a cartographic free library. The address is easily available here, and you can link to it by clicking on the image. These are being talked about in the forthcoming annual meetings of the African Studies Association, taking place later in November. And you're welcome to get access to this material as it's online. Further, you can see short videos with tricks, tips, and techniques with examples of how these can be used in a series they've put together through the Africa Map Circle called Explorations. You can find out a lot more of these things through the Africa Map Circle. The QR code is simple enough to scan on your cell phone, and you'll be taken right to the material.